You were never too much. You were just touching the part of them that learned. Closeness was dangerous. That wasn't your intensity. That wasn't your emotions. That wasn't your needs. That was their nervous system. And once you understand that, you stop shrinking yourself to fit inside someone else's fear. Because here's what really happened. You showed up open, consistent, present. You asked questions. You wanted depth. You leaned in when things felt meaningful. And instead of it deepening the bond, something shifted. They got distant, slower to reply, less affectionate, more irritable, more busy. And you felt it. That subtle withdrawal, that emotional step back. So you did what most emotionally available people do. You checked yourself. Was I too intense? Too emotional? Too available? Too honest? Too expressive? You replayed conversations in your head. You adjusted your tone. You softened your needs. You tried to be cool, low maintenance, understanding, independent. You told yourself, maybe I just need to give them space. But space didn't fix it. Because space was never the real issue. Regulation was. When someone has an avoidant survival pattern, closeness doesn't feel like love. It feels like exposure. It feels like risk. It feels like loss of control. Their body interprets intimacy as potential danger, not consciously, not maliciously, automatically. And when you moved closer emotionally, their nervous system moved into protection. That protection can look like detachment. It can look like criticism. It can look like sudden independence. It can look like, I just don't feel the same anymore. But most of the time, what they're actually feeling is overwhelm. Connection activates vulnerability. Vulnerability activates stored fear. Stored fear activates withdrawal. And now you're standing there, thinking you did something wrong. You didn't. You activated something old. See, avoidant patterns aren't about not caring. They're about early adaptation. At some point in their development, needing someone wasn't safe. Expressing emotion wasn't met consistently. Closeness didn't feel stable. So their nervous system learned. Depend on yourself. Minimize needs. Don't rely. Don't lean. Don't feel too much. And that strategy worked. It helped them survive. It helped them function. It helped them feel in control until they met someone who didn't operate that way. Someone like you. Someone who was emotionally available. Someone who wasn't afraid of intimacy. Someone who didn't see vulnerability as weakness. That kind of presence feels foreign to someone wired for self-protection. It feels destabilizing because now they're being invited into territory their nervous system has labeled unsafe. And when the body feels unsafe, it doesn't ask for clarity. It creates distance. This is why they can say, I care about you, and still pull away. Why they can feel deeply and still sabotage closeness. Why they can call you the best thing that ever happened to me and still leave. It's not logical. It's physiological. And that distinction matters. Because if you make it about personality, you'll spend years trying to tone yourself down. If you understand it's about nervous system wiring, you stop internalizing it. You stop editing yourself to avoid triggering someone else's fear. You stop abandoning your depth to protect their discomfort. Here's the part most people miss. When you were loving openly, you were also regulating the connection. Your consistency lowered their anxiety. Your reassurance softened their edges. Your emotional steadiness made intimacy feel manageable. You were co-regulating them. And it worked for a while until the closeness required reciprocity, until the emotional depth required them to lean into. That's when the imbalance becomes visible. You can only regulate someone else's nervous system for so long before your own becomes depleted. And the moment you ask for mutuality, their survival pattern gets louder. They may not even know why. They just feel pressure, and their body translates pressure as threat. So they create space, sometimes subtly, sometimes abruptly, sometimes through conflict, sometimes through silence. But the result is the same: distance. And when distance appears, your nervous system reacts too. You feel the shift. You feel the instability. You feel the uncertainty. And if you're not grounded, you start reaching, trying to restore connection, trying to calm the tension, trying to get back to how it was. But here's the truth: you can't love someone out of a survival pattern. You can't reassure someone into emotional capacity. You can't shrink enough to make intimacy feel safe for someone who hasn't healed. And the more you try, the more you abandon yourself. This is where so many people lose themselves. They confuse triggering someone's survival response with being too much. They mistake someone's shutdown for proof of their own excess. You weren't too emotional. You were emotionally available. You weren't too intense. You were present. You weren't too needy. You were relational. There is a difference. Too much implies imbalance. Survival activation implies incompatibility, incapacity. One is shame-based. The other is biological. And when you understand that, you stop trying to become smaller. You start asking better questions. Can this person tolerate intimacy? Can this person stay regulated when connection deepens? Can this person communicate when discomfort arises? Can this person meet me without withdrawing? Those are capacity questions, not worth questions, because your worth was never the issue. Their nervous system limit was. And here's where sovereignty comes in. Understanding someone's survival pattern does not mean tolerating its impact. Compassion does not require self-abandonment. You can understand why someone withdraws and still decide it doesn't work for you. You can empathize with their wiring and still choose stability. You can acknowledge their fear and still require consistency. Because love is not just about chemistry. It's about capacity. It's about regulation. It's about two nervous systems that can stay connected without one collapsing. If your presence consistently activates their need to escape, that is not romance. That is misalignment. And misalignment is not solved by becoming less. It's solved by becoming clearer. Clear about your needs. Clear about your standards. Clear about what feels safe in your body. Because here's the deeper layer. When you start shrinking, to avoid triggering someone's withdrawal, you begin living in hypervigilance. You monitor your tone. You monitor your needs. You monitor your reactions. You monitor how much you express. That is not love. That is adaptation. And if you grew up adapting too, it will feel familiar. But familiar does not mean healthy. Healthy feels stable. Healthy feels reciprocal. Healthy feels like you don't have to earn calm. So no, you were never too much. You were simply interacting with someone whose nervous system equates closeness with loss of control. And when control feels threatened, avoidance steps in, not because you lacked value, but because intimacy required expansion. They hadn't practiced. Your job was never to become less activating. Your job is to remain regulated in your own truth, to stop personalizing someone else's limits, to stop rewriting your personality, to fit inside someone's protective strategy. Because the right connection doesn't require you to shrink. It requires mutual regulation, mutual courage, mutual emotional presence. And until that's met, the most powerful thing you can do is stop interpreting withdrawal as proof that you were too much. It wasn't your intensity. It wasn't your depth. It wasn't your love. You simply touched a survival pattern that was never yours to fix. And once you truly understand that, you stop chasing. You stop over explaining. You stop proving. You stop bending. You start standing. Calm, clear, regulated, knowing that someone else's nervous system is not your responsibility to manage. And that realization changes everything. Here's what most people never see. When someone withdraws because their survival pattern is activated, it doesn't mean the feeling disappears. It means the body overrides it. Avoidant wiring doesn't erase attachment. It suppresses it. And suppression always has a cost. In the moment, distance feels relieving. Space feels calming. Independence feels stabilizing. Their nervous system finally exhales. No emotional pressure. No vulnerability exposure. No perceived demand. Just control. But what feels like peace at first is often just deactivation. And deactivation is not the same as healing. It's a temporary reduction of internal noise. That's why in the early stages of pulling away, they can look fine, composed, certain, even cold. They may genuinely believe they made the right choice because their body feels calmer, without closeness. But here's what happens next. Once the intensity of connection is gone, once your regulating presence is no longer there, once the relationship is no longer activating their fear, something else starts surfacing. Absence. And absence feels different than intimacy. Intimacy activates vulnerability. Absence activates loss. Loss doesn't feel threatening. It feels empty. And emptiness is harder to outrun because now there's no emotional demand to escape from. There's just silence. And in that silence, the nervous system begins to settle, not into avoidance, into awareness. They start remembering, not just the pressure, not just the moments they felt overwhelmed, but the safety, the consistency, the steadiness, the way your presence softened their edges, the way you stayed. Avoidant attachment often delays grief. They don't process in real time. They process in hindsight. When the thread of intimacy is gone, the attachment bond becomes clearer. This is why sometimes, weeks or months later, they circle back, not because they suddenly changed, but because the nervous system is no longer in active defense. Defense creates distortion. Calm creates clarity. And clarity can be uncomfortable because now they're left with the truth. You weren't overwhelming. You were available. You weren't demanding. You were relational. You weren't too much. You were simply asking them to participate. And participation required expansion. Expansion requires discomfort. Discomfort triggered survival. Survival triggered distance. But distance doesn't dissolve attachment. It delays confrontation with it. And here's where it gets deeper. When you stop chasing, when you stop explaining, when you stop trying to restore connection, you remove the external regulation. Now they are alone, with their own nervous system. And for someone used to self-reliance, that seems normal at first. But connection leaves an imprint, especially safe connection, especially consistent connection. Your absence is not neutral. It's a contrast. Before you, they may have been used to shallow bonds, low expectation dynamics, emotional minimalism. After you, they've experienced depth. And once someone experiences depth, superficial feels different. It doesn't satisfy in the same way. This doesn't mean they immediately evolve. It means their internal baseline shifts. And that shift lingers. Here's what many people misunderstand. Avoidants are not immune to attachment. They are selective about exposure. If you reached a level of closeness that touched vulnerability, you accessed something real. They may have pulled away, but they felt it. And once felt, it doesn't fully disappear. It gets compartmentalized, stored, reframed, sometimes minimized, but stored. That's why certain memories resurface later. not because of nostalgia, because of unresolved activation. Unfinished nervous system cycles don't close cleanly. They echo. You might notice it in subtle ways. They check in unexpectedly. They reference old moments. They test the water with neutrality. Not dramatic apologies, not emotional confessions, just small openings. This is not always manipulation. Often, it's curiosity meeting safety. They want to see if your energy is still accessible, if your regulation is still available to them, if the dynamic can return without requiring growth. And this is the critical moment, because if you step back into managing the connection, nothing changes. The survival pattern remains intact. But if your energy is different, calm, boundaried, self-contained, no pursuit, no pressure, no collapse, their nervous system registers something new. You are no longer trying to reduce their fear. You are no longer adjusting to keep them comfortable. You are regulated without them. And that changes the power dynamic entirely. Avoidant wiring relies on predictability. They expect pursuit after withdrawal. They expect reassurance after distance. They expect emotional effort to come from you. When that pattern breaks, it creates cognitive dissonance. Not drama, not chaos. Disruption. Disruption is powerful because survival strategies depend on repetition. Interrupt the repetition, and the system has to reassess. You are no longer activating their fear. By leaning in, you are no longer feeding their comfort. By chasing, you are simply present in yourself. And that presence feels different. It feels stable. It feels unmoved. It feels unavailable for old dynamics. And here's the truth most people avoid hearing. That is more impactful than emotional reaction ever was. Because reaction confirms attachment, regulation confirms self-trust. And self-trust is magnetic in a quiet way, not dramatic, not manipulative, grounded. Now, this does not guarantee they transform. Let's be clear. Awareness is not the same as change. Some avoidant patterns stay intact for years. Some people double down on independence. Some people distract, rebound, work more, scroll more, numb more. Survival adapts. But even when they suppress reflection, the imprint remains. You were not just a person. You were an experience of closeness. And the body remembers safety, even if the mind tries to minimize it. Here's the part that matters most for you. Your role is not to wait for their awareness. Your role is not to hope absence teaches them. Your role is to stay regulated in your own nervous system. Because here's the hidden layer. When you were trying to maintain connection, your system was activated too. You felt the instability, the unpredictability, the emotional inconsistency. Your body carried anxiety, while there's carried avoidance. That pairing creates chemistry. But chemistry is not compatibility. Compatibility feels calm. If you use your absence as a strategy to provoke reaction, you stay entangled. If you use your absence to restore yourself, you exit the survival loop. And once you exit the loop, the dynamic cannot operate the same way. They either expand or the distance becomes permanent. Both outcomes protect you because love that requires self-abandonment is not sustainable, and someone who can only connect when you are regulating them is not ready for mutuality. This is why understanding survival patterns is powerful. It removes personalization. It removes obsession. It removes the illusion that you need to adjust to be chosen. You weren't rejected for being too much. You were stepped back from because intimacy required internal growth, and growth cannot be outsourced. It cannot be loved into existence. It cannot be negotiated into stability. It must be chosen. So if you're wondering, what's happening inside them now? There may be relief. There may be quiet, there may be distraction, but eventually, if the connection was real, there is reflection, not always action, but reflection. And reflection is uncomfortable. For someone who ran from vulnerability, the question is no longer, will they feel it? The real question is, will they build capacity for it? And that answer has nothing to do with your intensity. It has everything to do with their willingness to face themselves. Meanwhile, your work is simpler. Stay regulated. Stay honest. Stay aligned. Let your nervous system settle. Without chasing resolution, let your body learn what stability feels like without unpredictability. Because once you experience calm connection, you will never confuse activation for love again. And that is the real shift. Not whether they come back, but whether you would accept the same pattern twice. Now, let's we go deeper. Not into them, into you. Because here's the part no one likes admitting. Even when you understand their survival pattern, you still felt pulled toward it. You still missed them. You still replayed moments. You still wondered if maybe you could have done something differently. That pull wasn't weakness. It was activation. When two nervous systems meet, they don't just exchange words. They exchange regulation. If you lean anxious and they lean avoidant, the chemistry can feel electric because their distance activates pursuit, and your pursuit activates their distance. It creates motion, intensity, high highs, sharp lows, uncertainty. And uncertainty is addictive, not because it feels good, but because it feels unfinished. Your nervous system doesn't crave them. It craves resolution. When someone pulls away without clarity, your body doesn't relax. It searches, it scans, it replays conversations, it analyzes tone shifts, it tries to restore balance. That's not obsession. That's a nervous system trying to close a loop. Avoidant dynamics rarely close loops cleanly. They fade, they withdraw, they reduce contact gradually, and your body stays mid-sentence, mid-emotion, mid-attachment. That suspended state creates craving. Craving feels like love, but it's often incomplete regulation. And when you understand that, you stop romanticizing the intensity. You start observing it. Here's what trauma bonding actually is. It's not loving too hard. It's attachment formed under inconsistency. Warmth followed by withdrawal. Connection followed by distance. Affection followed by silence. That rhythm wires the brain. Intermittent reinforcement is powerful. When safety is predictable, the body relaxes. When safety is unpredictable, the body fixates. You weren't addicted to them. You were conditioned by the pattern. Your nervous system learned. Closeness equals reward. Withdrawal equals threat. So every time they returned, dopamine spiked, relief flooded in, hope reactivated, and when they pulled back again, cortisol rose, anxiety followed. The contrast intensified attachment. That doesn't mean it wasn't real. It means it was amplified. And amplification can disguise incompatibility. If love feels like adrenaline, it's usually activation. If love feels like steady breath, it's regulation. Most people raised in inconsistency confuse activation with passion because chaos feels familiar. Familiar feels like home. So when someone stable appears, it can feel boring, flat, too calm. But calm is what secure attachment feels like. Not dramatic, not intoxicating, grounded. If you felt magnetized to someone avoidant, it's worth asking, what part of me felt recognized in that dynamic? Sometimes it's not about them. It's about what you learned growing up. Did you have to work for attention? Did love feel conditional? Did emotional closeness require effort? If so, your system may equate effort with value. So when someone withdraws, you don't step back. You lean in because earning connection feels meaningful. But secure love is not earned, it's reciprocated. And this is where the survival loop breaks. When you stop trying to win closeness, when you stop trying to prove worth, when you stop interpreting distance as challenge. Distance is information. It's not a test. It's not an invitation to perform. It's a signal of capacity. If someone withdraws when intimacy deepens, that's their nervous system limit, not your inadequacy. And when you internalize that, your body starts to calm. The craving reduces. The rumination softens. Because the loop is no longer open. You accept the data. You stop negotiating with it. This doesn't mean you feel nothing. You may still miss them. You may still love parts of them. But the urgency fades. And urgency is what keeps trauma bonds alive. Here's something most people don't realize. Avoidant partners often feel the same intensity, but process it differently. Where you feel anxiety and reach outward, they feel anxiety and move inward. Where you seek reassurance, they seek space. Both are attempts at regulation. Neither is villainous, but the mismatch creates friction. And friction, over time, erodes trust. Not because either person is bad, because the nervous systems are incompatible at that stage. You cannot calm an avoidant by chasing. You cannot calm an anxious system by distancing. One feels pursued. One feels abandoned. Both feel unsafe. And safety is the foundation of lasting attachment. So the real healing begins when you turn attention inward, not to fix yourself, but to understand your own activation. When they pulled away, what story did your mind create? I'm not enough. I was too emotional. I should have been cooler. I scared them. That story becomes identity if not challenged. But those stories were formed long before them. They were reinforced by the dynamic. They were triggered by distance. But they didn't originate there. When you regulate your nervous system, those narratives lose intensity. You start seeing patterns without shame. You start recognizing red flags earlier. You stop overextending. You pause instead of pursuing. And that pause changes everything. Because when you no longer chase, you observe. And observation brings clarity. Not the kind that fuels ego, the kind that protects peace. You begin asking different questions. Not, how do I get them back? But does this dynamic feel stable? Not, why wasn't I enough? But did this connection feel mutual? Not, how do I prove my value? But was my value recognized? Those shifts signal growth. Growth doesn't feel dramatic. It feels steady, subtle, quiet. You respond slower. You tolerate silence better. You don't interpret space as rejection immediately. That's nervous system maturity. And once you experience that, the old survival chemistry loses its grip. Here's the paradox. When you become regulated, avoidant individuals sometimes reappear. Not because you manipulated the situation, but because your energy changed. You're no longer activating their defenses in the same way. You're not pushing for closeness. You're not collapsing in anxiety. You're stable. And stability feels safer to approach. But this is where discernment matters. Are they returning with awareness? Or returning because the intensity is lower? Growth requires ownership. It requires language. It requires accountability. Without that, patterns repeat. Calm energy alone cannot heal someone unwilling to self-reflect. And you cannot regulate someone into maturity. They must choose expansion. If they don't, your regulation becomes self-protection. You stay grounded. You don't get pulled into old rhythms. You don't mistake curiosity for commitment. You don't interpret contact as transformation. You assess behavior, consistency, emotional availability, not promises, not nostalgia, not chemistry. And here's something important. You don't have to demonize them to detach. You don't have to label them incapable. You don't have to erase the good moments. You can acknowledge there was connection, there was depth, there was real emotion, and still recognize it wasn't sustainable in that form. That balanced view signals healing. Because you're no longer polarized, you're integrated. Integration is when you can hold both truth and disappointment, both care and boundaries, both memory and forward movement. That's secure energy. And secure energy doesn't beg. It doesn't perform. It doesn't chase potential. It aligns with reciprocity. If someone cannot meet you there, you don't shrink. You step forward without them. That's not detachment from feeling. It's detachment from survival loops. You were never too much, but you may have tolerated too little. You may have accepted inconsistency as depth. You may have mistaken silence for complexity. You may have romanticized emotional unavailability. Awareness doesn't shame you. It empowers you. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And that's where freedom begins. Not in making them understand, but in understanding yourself. Not in waiting for their clarity, but in stabilizing your own. Not in proving you weren't too much, but in recognizing that someone secure wouldn't have framed you that way at all. And when your nervous system fully absorbs that, you stop asking to be chosen. You choose differently. That is the shift. That is the interruption. That is where survival ends and security begins. Because once you understand survival patterns, once you see how activation works, once you recognize how trauma bonds form, the final shift is not about decoding them anymore. It's about redefining what you accept. Here's what changes when this fully lands inside you. You stop trying to be digestible. You stop softening your needs to keep someone comfortable. You stop translating your emotions into smaller versions so they don't feel overwhelmed. You stop negotiating with silence. And most importantly, you stop confusing emotional limitation with emotional depth. Avoidant energy can feel profound, quiet, complex, layered. But complexity is not the same as capacity. Someone can feel deeply and still lack the ability to sustain intimacy. Someone can love you and still retreat when love asks for vulnerability. Someone can mean what they say in one moment and disappear in the next when their nervous system feels threatened. Understanding this removes fantasy, and fantasy is what keeps people stuck. When you believed you were too much, you were trying to become manageable. When you believed you overwhelmed them, you were trying to become smaller. When you believed if you were calmer, cooler, less emotional, they would stay, you were negotiating against your own wiring. But secure love does not require shrinking. It does not require emotional self-editing. It does not require performing low-maintenance femininity to feel chosen. It requires mutual regulation, two nervous systems that can both stay present. When intimacy deepens, two people who can tolerate closeness without perceiving it as threat, two adults who don't interpret vulnerability as loss of control. That is not dramatic. It's stable, and stable feels unfamiliar. When you've been wired for intensity, here's the deeper truth. If you healed the shame of being too much, you also heal the attraction to people who reinforce that narrative. Because once you no longer see your depth as a flaw, you stop bonding with those who treat it like one. And this is where power returns to you. Not power over them, power over your own standard. You no longer chase clarity from someone who avoids conversations. You no longer tolerate emotional ambiguity as mystery. You no longer romanticize withdrawal. You recognize it. You name it. You decide if it aligns. That decision is everything. Because the moment you stop trying to convince someone to stay. You break the survival loop entirely. Let's be clear about something. This isn't about punishing avoidant people. It's not about demonizing attachment styles. It's about recognizing nervous system compatibility. You can have compassion for someone's wiring without sacrificing your own stability. You can understand why they withdrew without chasing them into healing. You can validate their fear without becoming responsible for regulating it. That balance is maturity. And maturity feels different in the body. It feels steady, grounded, unrushed. You don't panic when someone goes quiet. You observe. You don't over-explain. When someone pulls back, you pause. You don't assume you caused it. You assess. That shift alone changes who can access you. Because emotionally unavailable people rely on emotional labor. They rely on the other person filling gaps, initiating repair, carrying conversation, reaching first. If you stop doing that, some connections dissolve, not because you failed, because they required imbalance to survive. An imbalance is no longer your baseline. You were never too much, but you might have been overfunctioning. You might have been regulating for two. You might have been tolerating inconsistency because you believed intensity equaled value. Now imagine something different. Imagine someone who leans in when you express emotion, who doesn't freeze when you need reassurance, who doesn't create space when intimacy deepens, who doesn't interpret vulnerability as pressure. That doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like relief. And relief is underrated. Relief is what secure attachment feels like. Your nervous system softens. Your breathing stabilizes. You don't overanalyze texts. You don't brace for withdrawal. You don't prepare yourself for emotional disappearance. You exist, calmly, reciprocally. That is what becomes available to you when you stop chasing survival patterns. Now here's something important. When you shift into this secure energy, some avoidant partners may feel it. They may sense your detachment, your steadiness, your non-reactivity, and they might re-engage. Not dramatically, not with grand declarations, but subtly, testing, curious. And this is where discernment becomes non-negotiable, because your healing is not proven by how calm you stay during their return. It's proven by what you allow after it. Do they communicate differently? Do they acknowledge their patterns? Do they take ownership without defensiveness? Do they initiate emotional depth instead of retreating from it? Awareness is attractive, but accountability is what creates safety. Without accountability, patterns repeat in softer packaging, and you deserve more than a refined version of the same cycle. You deserve consistency. Consistency isn't flashy. It doesn't spike dopamine. It doesn't create adrenaline. It creates peace. And peace feels foreign when your body is used to survival mode. But once you acclimate to peace, you won't trade it for intensity again. That's the true transformation. Not making them realize your worth, but realizing you don't need someone dysregulated to validate it. You don't need to interrupt their survival pattern to be valuable. You don't need to shrink for connection. You don't need to prove emotional depth to someone who fears it. You simply need alignment. And alignment is mutual. Now, if this resonated, if something in you felt seen instead of blamed, that means the shame is already loosening. And that's where everything shifts. Because once you stop identifying as too much, you start identifying as emotionally available, emotionally literate, emotionally capable, and that identity attracts differently. So here's what I want you to do. Not for me, for yourself. Comment the word regulated if you're choosing to stop shrinking and start stabilizing. If you're choosing compatibility over chemistry. If you're choosing peace over pursuit. Not because they didn't love you, but because love without capacity isn't enough. And once you understand that, you don't chase survival anymore. You build security, quietly, confidently, sovereign.